Welcome to Bullshift the podcast. This is the podcast where we talk about behavioral economics in general and specifically about how the financial services industry shifts your attention to make you feel more bullish. My name is John DeGuy. I'm the host of the podcast and the author of the book Bullshift. My guest this week is John A. Turner. John is a Ph.D. and a director of the Pension Policy Center, where he provides pension policy analysis for the United States and international organizations. He served as a senior policy advisor at the ARP, which is the American Association of Retired Persons Public Policy Institute. And previously, he worked at International Labor Organization in Geneva, Switzerland. He's written dozens of peer-reviewed articles about pensions and their applications, and it's my pleasure to welcome him this week. John, welcome.
Thank you.
Because your work is with pensions, and because I don't normally have a lot of pension consultants on the podcast, I'm wondering if you could take a moment to walk us through what a typical week is like in your on your agenda. What do you do in a week-to-week basis?
Well, I am a research economist, which means I spend most of my time writing papers. And most of my papers I write with co authors. So currently, I have several papers going on. I have two co authors in China, one in Canada, Sally Shen. She's an excellent researcher. And I have four in Poland. So anyway, I have a diverse group of people that I work with. So part of my week is always involved with communicating with my co-authors, but much of it is just me working on my different projects.
As a general rule, would you say people that give advice to ordinary investors are aware of the research that's being done, not necessarily just by you, but how would you characterize the level of awareness with regard to evidence and research on the part of people who give advice to ordinary investors?
I have a number of criticisms of the advice giving profession, um, but that wasn't your question. The people who give advice are well educated, they're well trained. I think generally they understand the economic fundamentals.
Okay.
I would say,
What?
not related to your question, another area where it's important to have knowledge is the judiciary system. In the United States, many judges who rule on pension issues have very low level of financial knowledge.
Right. Okay. Very good. I wanted to begin the introduction to your world by taking you back to your days when you were doing your PhD at Chicago. And uh, before we started recording, you were telling me the story about your PhD dissertation. Can you share that story, please? Because I think it's so remarkable.
The story is remarkable. I haven't heard anybody who has the same story as mine. But when I was at Chicago, everybody had three dissertation advisors on their dissertation committee. And so my advisors were Gary Becker, T.W. Schultz, and James Hickman. And non economists may not be familiar with all those people, but after I received my dissertation, all three of those people individually for their own research received the Nobel Prize. And I was just so fortunate to have such an incredible group of talented economists to work with.
It's almost like it's automatic if you're on faculty at the economics program at Chicago that you're going to get a Nobel before your career is over. I think there are more Nobels at the University of Chicago than at any other school in the world. In fact, I'm quite
I'm
sure of
sure
it.
that's
So
right. Yes.
yeah, so congratulations to you. That's a fascinating little nugget of information. Would you say pension plans are inclined to use assumptions and models that are different from those that are used by ordinary people when you start thinking of the consulting that you do and the research you do for pension plans, do you think people who run pension plans are using assumptions that are the same as or in any way different from the assumptions that are used for people who give advice to one-on-one people?
I would say there's two parts to the answer to that question. That's for people who run defined benefit plans.
Mhm,
Many of those plans use uh, assumptions on rate of return to reduce the funding requirement that they have. And the way they do that is they use a high expected rate of return. And the studies have shown that, particularly in the United States, for plans that are underfunded, they tend to use high expected rates of return to overstate their funding and reduce the funding requirements that they have. So that's one side of it, the defined benefit plans, and the actuaries who they hire go along with that. So it's a problem partly that the actuaries will accept those unrealistic assumptions. However, on the DC side, the defined contribution side, the knowledgeable financial advisors tend to use low assumed rates of return, lower than the assumed rates of return the participants tend to use.
mhm,
And there's two aspects to that, I think. One is that participants do tend to be a little bit bullish on their rates of return assumptions. And but the other part is that if you're working with a financial advisor who is paid based on how much you've invested, they want you to invest more. And so they have a financial incentive to say, based on my assumptions, your current investments and contributions will lead to this amount. You really should invest more with me. Of course, I'll charge you more in fees when you do that. So, so it's a little bit complicated to answer,
yeah.
um, but for the participants, there is a tendency for participants to tend to be bullish on their assumptions on investment returns.
It's funny because there are perils in both directions. On the one hand, people would argue that when people giving advice tell people to expect higher rates of return, such as the people who are the sponsors of these DB plans, they're it creates a false sense of confidence on the part of the investors. On the other hand, if you use lower assumptions, which I would argue is more reasonable and more evidence based, you run the risk of the allegation that you're doing so expressly in order to gather more assets so that you can charge more in fees. So you have to pick your poison. Either way, there will be an allegation that can be levied against you, and it's very difficult for people to determine exactly what the right level ought to be. In your estimation, in your experience, um, I heard you say a moment ago that people who run sponsor defined benefit plans use assumptions that are too high. Could you maybe weigh in on the order of magnitude? Is it one half of 1%? Is it one and a half? Is it 2.5%? How aggressive are they in their assumptions
Well,
relative to what they ought to be?
I like to just refine that answer just a little bit. Um, that it's not that all of them use assumptions that are too high. It's a particular group of ones, and they tend to be underfunded, and they tend to
Mhm.
be union multi-employer plans. Um, but there's a general tendency to do it. So I would say that there's also a range that for the worst uh, the worst examples tend to be the union plans, and they could be like maybe 1 or 2 percentage points too high, which is a substantial amount. For the other plans, it would be small, like maybe 0.5% or a
Mhm.
percent.
Okay. Okay. What about comparing and contrasting defined benefit plans and defined contribution plans? In your experience, when you deal with the sponsors of these plans, do you find that their participants are well versed in understanding what the differences are between the two alternatives?
Yes, I think that the participants have a good understanding, but that's because the plans are so different.
Right.
Uh, it, um, it may be, though, now that there are so few defined benefit plans that uh, um, when there were both, when there were a lot of defined benefit plans, I think maybe there's a better understanding of the differences of them. Now, most people have, or many people have no experience with defined benefit plans. And so they don't know, I think.
And if they're, as a result, because virtually everyone these days that's in a pension plan is in a defined contribution plan, how well would you say people calibrate their own risk profile? Which is to say, if they're working directly with their employer and there's no intermediary giving them advice, how well do you think people who have DC plans, defined contribution plans, match their risk profile and their asset allocation to their actual needs?
Uh, this is a answer depends on the financial literacy of the people, and many people are not financially literate. Um, but given that, there are differences in tolerance for risk across people. For example, as a broad generalization, women tend to tolerate, they want to have lower risk portfolios than men. I know just in my family, my wife and I differ somewhat considerably in that extent. In principle, a financially literate person would realize in a family they have a spouse, and so it's not just their own investments. So it's not as risky as if they just do it by themselves. Um, and some people I know they just don't like the fluctuations in their account balances that go with risk, and they tend to be have very low risk portfolios. And while that reflects their feelings about risk, it also reflects a lack of knowledge, I think, as to the penalty they're paying in their future retirement benefits by having such low rates of return.
Which brings me to a point that you made a moment ago about the assumed rates of return and the expected rates of return. In your experience in working with those handful of defined benefit plans, which is all that's left, is just a handful of them, what return expectations do most of them have for their participants? Uh, can you maybe look under the hood and tell us what your experience is in terms of the return that they project going out for generations going forward, what they expect and what they tell their participants? What numbers are we using?
I, I don't have a very good answer for that. The work I did in that area specifically was a number of years ago. I don't remember, but I would say um, I think that for a portfolio, say 60% stocks, 40% bonds, that's
Mhm.
certainly a 7% rate of return uh, would be in the range of being reasonable. I personally have a more risky portfolio. I'm almost entirely in stock. And so I expect a higher percentage, like maybe 8 or 9% myself.
Well, it's funny because here in Canada, we have the main organization for financial planners has assumptions guidelines that come out every spring. And they've been telling us that the appropriate expectation for returns for equities is in the very high sixes and very low sevens. So call
Interesting.
it 6.6 to 7.2 as the expected rate of return, whether it's emerging markets, Canada, US, EFI, you name it, and that's just for the return of the benchmark. And of course, if you're an investor, either in a pension plan or working on your own, you may have to pay an advisor, but you certainly have to pay for product costs. So those benchmark returns are going to be even lower still. And if you have an even remotely balanced portfolio, a lot of people here in Canada, at least, are being told that they should be expecting returns on a balanced portfolio net of fees to come in somewhere around 5%. And I'm wondering if you could weigh in on what your experience is with the typical. If you were to tell the typical, let's go back to defined contribution plans. If you were to tell a typical DC investor with a traditional balanced portfolio, a 60/40 portfolio or a 70/30 portfolio, that they should be expecting a long-term return of about 5%, how do you think they would react?
Well, I think they would be unhappy, but I, I, I'm not nearly as knowledgeable about Canada as the United States, but my
Yeah.
understanding is that the fees in Canada are substantially higher than in the United States. And just for example, um, on my government DC plan, the fees are about 4 basis points.
Wow.
It's extremely low. But
Mm.
so that's a government-run plan. There's some subsidy a little bit from the government running it. They don't charge all the administrative costs. However, when I invest with Vanguard, which anybody can invest in Vanguard, I'm very conscious of the fees I pay. And the fees of my Vanguard portfolio are maybe like 6 basis points, which is also extremely low. And it's made a huge difference in my financial wealth over the years. And in Canada, if you have fees like of 200 basis points, I don't. You should be the one that said the correct number. It makes a big
Well,
difference.
okay, so there are two components to the fees. There's what you're paying for the advice, and the numbers there between Canada and the US are not radically different, but the product cost can be. We have more money in mutual funds in Canada than we have in index funds or in ETFs by a wide margin, perhaps a 4-to-1 margin. Whereas I just saw data coming from the United States that in late 2023, for the first time, there was more money in passive, low cost options than there was in uh, expensive, high, actively managed options. So the US has done a much better job in terms of investor education and adopting products that reflect the lower fees. We have companies like Vanguard in Canada as well, but the Vanguard products in Canada don't cost 4 or 6%. They will oftentimes cost 24 or 26% basis points. So it's 4 or 6 basis points. So
Mhm.
0.04 in the US and 0.24 in Canada. Uh, so it's it's still relatively cheap, but it's depending on how you look at it. You can also argue that it's 6 times more expensive between 4 basis points and 24 basis points. At any rate, the 20 basis points difference in margin is going to go straight to your bottom line. The expected return will be 20 basis points lower as a result of the cost being 20 basis points higher. And Americans get that. And the sense that I'm getting from you, John, is that American investors, even those in defined contribution plans, understand the importance of cost. I can tell you that in Canada, it's tough slogging. The industry likes to get people thinking about total return and after cost return and whatnot, but they don't pay as much attention to product cost in Canada as they do in the US. And when I say they, I'm talking about both investors and the people who give advice. They tend to not worry about that as much either. That's just a sad state of the reality of how things work here.
I would say in the United States, um, I have surveyed my economist friends over the years, and almost all of them invest with Vanguard,
Mhm.
and that's because they recognize the importance of fees. However, my non-economist friends, many of them have a poor understanding of the importance of fees.
Right. Yeah. So we were talking earlier about financial literacy and how that can be a problem for a lot of DC participants. But there are alternative approaches dealing with how to make people more savvy. And I'm wondering if you could offer some thoughts on things like regular defaults and target date funds as a means of fixing that challenge.
So it is a big problem that many people are financially illiterate. And it might seem like the logical answer would be, well, provide them education so they become literate. And of course, that could work, but is that the best approach to do it in terms of the cost of the approach? And many people, when they're adults, they just aren't interested in spending the time to become financially literate. They have other demands on their time. Uh, so, uh, it's my personal feeling that instead of focusing on financial literacy, at least for adults, it's probably a good idea for students, but for adults, I think that things like target date funds, where the portfolio automatically adjusts as you reach your retirement, uh, and defaults are a really good approach. That while it's not perfect, it brings people into a reasonable portfolio given their age and their years of retirement.
That's great. And I think a lot of what we have to do, it seems, in the financial services industry is to find ways to honorably nudge people to do things that are in their own self-interest, in a way that doesn't constrain their choices, but that allows them to do hopefully what is objectively best for them. And a lot of this is coming from research written by one of the other people over at the University of Chicago, Richard Thaler, which I don't know if you know Professor Thaler, but
Oh,
he's
yes,
done
he's
a
very
great deal
well
of work.
known.
Yeah, yeah. Great. Okay. Well, I think that's really all I needed to cover with you today, John. I always end with two things. And the first is something that I call that's bullshit. And that's bullshit is where I invite my guests to weigh in on something that they think is wrong with the way the financial services industry is functioning today. What would you say if you could identify one thing? What would you say is bullshit in the industry?
So I'll give you an example of the problem I see. That, as I mentioned earlier, the thrift savings plan, which is for federal government workers, has extremely low fees of roughly 4 basis points. A friend of mine, who is a very smart woman, uh, when she retired, she was advised to roll her money out of the thrift savings plan and into uh, an arrangement where the advisor charged 150 basis points for advice. And then the investments were like maybe 30 basis points. And he said that she did this. The thrift savings plan only has like 5 or 6 options. She would have unlimited investment options, and which is true. And she did it. And that is an extreme example of what I consider to be one of the worst problems in the United States in financial advice. That And I wrote a paper specifically about that. And it's about financial illiteracy confronting conflicted advice.
Right.
So you have on the one side a financially illiterate person, and the other side a person who has a conflict because he'll make more money if he advises you to have an expensive option. So to me, that's the problem that I would focus on.
Okay. So the follow-up question is shift happens. If it was up to you and you could find a way to deal with that problem, how exactly would you deal with the problem of conflicted advice?
Well, it's a difficult problem to deal with in a way because uh, the because of the lack of sophistication on the person who's receiving advice. So the first step would be to require that advice, the advisor has a fiduciary duty to give advice in the best interest of the client. However, that alone will not solve the problem because this is an example of my friend, she thought she was getting good advice. She would never report that as an abusive advice. So it's very hard when you have the fiduciary duty to really adequately enforce it. But that's a step in the right direction in any case.
It's funny because you and I are cut from the same cloth. My first book, The Professional Financial Advisor, had 4 editions, and I talked about in Canada, the journey toward regulatory reform and the ability to be a fiduciary. And in the U.S., there's a model called the RIA model, the Registered Investment Advisor, and the RIAs are fiduciaries. In Canada, there's no analogous registration, but there are portfolio managers. So in Canada, only about 3 or 4% of all registrants are considered fiduciaries under the law, because only 3 or 4% of registrants are portfolio managers or investment counselors. So it's again, there are similarities and there are differences between Canada and the U.S. But I think there's no doubt that there's still a great deal of work to be done in combating the inherent bias, the optimistic viewpoint of the industry, which will have people believe that everything is totally fine, and that there's that there's not much to be done because all the problems have been solved and everything is working fine, which I think is a bit of a stretch. John, I want to thank you for your time today. It's been a real pleasure, and I want to wish you all the best in your work down the road.
Thank you very much. It was a pleasure for me also.
John DeGooey is a portfolio manager in Toronto and the author of the book Bullshift: How Optimism Bias Threatens Your Finances. Bullshift is available online and in bookstores everywhere. The opinions expressed in this podcast should not be construed as investment advice. Bullshift, the podcast, is produced by TalkShoe, a division of IOTM.